Few words carry as much loaded historical baggage as the Inquisition. Popular culture has turned it into shorthand for indiscriminate religious violence on a massive scale, often disconnected from what the actual historical institutions involved, and this is genuinely plural rather than a single unified thing, actually did, how they operated, and how their scale compares to popular perception. This video is about separating documented historical fact from centuries of exaggeration, some of it originating in genuine religious and political conflict of the period, and some of it added considerably later for various propagandistic purposes. As with our previous video on the Crusades, this is a genuinely weighty topic, and we're going to handle it carefully and factually. Welcome to Pope Pulse. This continues our deep dive into Catholic Church history. The first thing worth clarifying is that the Inquisition wasn't a single, unified institution operating consistently across centuries and across all of Europe. Historians generally distinguish between several genuinely distinct inquisitorial bodies, each with different origins, different jurisdictions, and meaningfully different historical records. The medieval Inquisition, sometimes called the Papal Inquisition, developed beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, initially in response to specific concerns about certain Christian religious movements that church authorities considered heretical, including groups like the Cathars in southern France. The Spanish Inquisition, established considerably later in 1478 under Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, operated under a genuinely different structure, notably under considerably greater direct control by the Spanish crown rather than direct papal administration, even though it operated with papal authorization. The Roman Inquisition, established later still in 1542, operated as a more centralized Vatican institution specifically overseeing doctrinal matters within Italian territories and, more broadly, coordinating church responses to the Protestant Reformation across Catholic Europe. Treating these as one single, continuous institution flattens genuinely important differences in scale, method, and historical context, and it's a big part of why popular understanding of this topic tends to be so significantly distorted compared to what the actual historical record shows. Inquisitorial bodies, across their various distinct forms, functioned primarily as ecclesiastical courts specifically tasked with investigating and addressing suspected heresy, meaning beliefs or practices considered to deviate from official Catholic doctrine, generally within populations that were nominally already Catholic, rather than functioning as a tool for converting non-Christians by force, a common but historically inaccurate popular assumption. These courts followed documented legal procedures, including formal accusations, investigation processes, and opportunities for the accused to respond to specific charges, procedures that, while falling well short of modern standards of due process and containing genuinely serious flaws by any contemporary legal standard, were nonetheless considerably more procedurally structured than the purely arbitrary, chaotic mob violence often depicted in popular fictional portrayals. Historical records, including surviving trial documentation from various inquisitorial courts, show structured proceedings involving testimony, and in many documented cases, eventual acquittal or relatively minor penance-based penalties rather than the severe punishments most commonly associated with popular Inquisition imagery. This isn't intended to minimize genuinely serious documented abuses, including the use of torture in extracting confessions in specific documented cases, and genuinely severe punishments, including execution, that were applied in a meaningful number of cases across the various inquisitorial bodies' full histories. It's intended to establish accurately what kind of institution we're actually discussing before addressing scale and severity in the sections that follow record shows. Popular culture has often suggested casualty figures for the various inquisitions running into the hundreds of thousands or even millions, but rigorous historical research drawing on surviving trial records paints a considerably different, though still genuinely serious, picture. For the Spanish Inquisition specifically, which operated for several centuries and is generally considered the most extensively documented of the major inquisitorial bodies given a substantial surviving trial record archive, modern historical research drawing on this archive generally estimates total executions across its full multi-century operation numbering in the low thousands, a figure considerably, dramatically lower than the popular imagination often suggests, though scholarly estimates do vary somewhat depending on methodology and which specific time periods and regions are included in a given count. This is an important distinction worth making clearly. A documented death toll in the low thousands across several centuries represents genuinely serious, real historical violence and injustice against real individuals, deserving serious historical attention rather than dismissal, but it's a meaningfully different historical picture than the popular image of indiscriminate, massive-scale slaughter that has developed in broader popular culture over the centuries since, often shaped considerably more by later political and religious propaganda than by the actual documented historical record. If the documented historical numbers are considerably lower than popular perception generally suggests, it's worth asking directly where that considerably larger, more extreme popular image actually originated. Historians generally point to what's sometimes called the Black Legend, a term referring to a body of anti-Spanish political and religious propaganda that developed particularly during the 16th and 17th centuries, produced largely by Spain's political and religious rivals during a period of intense Protestant-Catholic conflict across Europe, along with genuine geopolitical rivalry between Spain and various other European powers competing for influence and colonial territory during this same period. This propaganda tradition often deliberately exaggerated Spanish Inquisition practices considerably beyond the documented historical record, for clear and well-understood political purposes tied to that specific period's broader religious and imperial conflicts. This exaggerated tradition then persisted and further developed across subsequent centuries, particularly during the Enlightenment period, when various thinkers critical of organized religious institutions more broadly frequently invoked the Inquisition as a symbol of religious institutional abuse of power, sometimes drawing on and further amplifying the earlier Black Legend tradition's already exaggerated figures rather than engaging carefully with the more measured documented historical record. This layered history of successive exaggeration across several centuries, for a range of distinct political and ideological purposes, helps explain the considerable gap between popular modern perception and what more rigorous, document-based historical research actually shows. The Vatican itself has, in more recent decades, taken a notably more open approach to this history compared to earlier centuries, including opening significant portions of the Roman Inquisition's own historical archives to outside academic researchers beginning in the late 1990s, a decision that has directly enabled considerably more rigorous, document-based historical research into this topic than was previously possible for scholars working without direct archival access. This kind of archival access has allowed modern historians to move considerably beyond both the older exaggerated popular tradition and any potential opposite tendency toward uncritical historical apologetic, instead grounding historical understanding directly in surviving primary source documentation, including actual trial records, correspondence, and administrative documentation from the institutions themselves. This represents a genuinely significant shift in how this difficult historical topic can now be studied and understood, compared to relying primarily on second-hand accounts, later propaganda traditions, or popular cultural depictions considerably removed from the original documented historical record. It's worth asking directly why the specific numbers and institutional details actually matter, beyond simple historical accuracy for its own sake, particularly given that real documented injustice and real human suffering genuinely did occur across these various institutions' full multi-century histories, regardless of the exact final tally. Getting the history right matters because both significant exaggeration and significant minimization ultimately distort our ability to understand how religious and political institutions have historically wielded coercive legal power, and what specific structural and institutional factors have historically constrained or, in various documented cases, failed to adequately constrain that power. Considerably overstating historical numbers, however unintentionally, tends to obscure the specific institutional mechanisms, legal procedures, and particular historical and political conditions that actually enabled real documented abuses, replacing careful historical understanding with a comparatively vague, generalized narrative of purely arbitrary religious violence that doesn't accurately reflect how these particular historical institutions actually operated in practice. Accurate historical understanding, by contrast, allows for a considerably more useful and specific kind of institutional accountability and historical learning, one grounded in genuinely documented mechanisms and specific historical causes rather than in a popular image shaped considerably more by centuries of political propaganda than by the underlying documented historical record itself. So the real history here is genuinely more complicated, and in terms of raw scale, less extreme than popular culture generally suggests. Several genuinely distinct institutions rather than one single unified body, real documented injustice and real suffering that deserves serious historical attention, and a popular image substantially shaped by centuries of political propaganda considerably removed from what more rigorous, document-based modern historical research actually shows. If you're finding this kind of careful myth versus reality approach to difficult church history valuable, subscribe to Pope Pulse for more, and let me know in the comments. Did the actual documented numbers surprise you compared to what you generally understood about this topic before watching?